Welcome back to the Lighthouse. We're now about to enter the economic visions constellation, in which we can think about the world and imagine ways how to change it. Our guest today, Yanis Varoufakis, is no stranger to these questions and no stranger to YSI. In fact, Yanis was at the place YSI was founded back in 2012 at the INET Paradigm Loss Conference. He was one of the speakers in one of the first YSI webinars, and he also joined us in Paris at the INET conference as he was finance minister of Greece. Now let us remember why we're here. We're here to explore new economic questions. These are our questions that we want to work on in the future in YSI. And throughout this conference, we want to collaboratively converge on 100 questions that we will celebrate at the end of the conference. Now, let's all join together up in the economic visions constellation, in which we will suggest questions and allow Yanis to reflect upon them in the aftermath of his talk. How this works exactly, we will see now.
First, go to ysiplenary.org and click the night sky. This is the questions fair, where each star is a question, and each group of stars, or constellation, contains questions within a particular topic. You can find questions fair sessions in the schedule in the left sidebar and join them from there. Just enter the session and join the Zoom. As you listen to the speaker motivate their questions, think about which questions you believe to be pertinent for YSI. While the speaker talks, suggest your questions to your peers by entering them into the panel. This is not a Q&A. The questions are suggestions for research in YSI, not a question for the speaker to answer. Take a look at all the questions that were suggested and like the ones that you think are best. The questions moderator will select the most liked questions and present them to the speaker for a comment. These questions will be added to the constellation, where they can be further refined. Refine the questions by finding the best exact phrasing. Suggest a rephrasing yourself, or like the rephrasings that you think are good. After the session is over, you can find the submitted questions in the constellations. As a plenary participant, you can mark your 10 favorite questions in the graph. Just click the star in the corner of the questions card, and they will be added to your YSI profile. The most popular questions will make it into the final list.
Well, now we know how it works. And before we go up into the economic visions constellation to hear Yanis give his input, I would like to just say that you'll see me there too. I'm about to beam up myself. And I will be asking a question to Yanis as well. And the question reads, how do we solve the collective action problem of national states to cooperate in facing the global challenge of climate change? I'll be writing that question up in the constellation. You can see it there. For now, let me just have a quick tech check. Yanis, check. Good. Nicolas, check. Cecilia, check. Okay, we're ready to go. Let's beam up to the constellation.
Economic vision, economic vision, economic vision, economic vision.
Economic vision. Is this the whole system? It's the human condition to have no clue what you're missing. When's it best to move on individual missions? And when's it in your interest to uphold the holism? What's your economic vision? Let's talk economics. The process of production and its profits and progress. The science by which nation states and trade are made prosperous. And plausibly is often that which causes their problems. Is economics topic what we think's gonna happen so we can make the right predictions such that profits are maximum? Or is it for humanity's communal advancement? Have we traded religion for enchantments of mammon? I'm just asking, I take it on trust, that there are others who can understand the task as they must. Are we masters of the system or is it using us? That's the question, ain't it? Economic vision or bust?
Economic vision, economic vision.
Hi everyone, welcome to this amazing talk. My name is Cecilia Recap. I'm the outgoing coordinator of the States and Markets Working Group, and I will be the question moderator of this session. As the video has just explained to you all, we are on the move to arrive to the 100 most pertinent questions of our time. These questions will guide our future research and projects in YSI. And we are here in the Economic Vision Constellation hosting an input talk from Yanis Varoufakis, which will inspire us all in suggesting new questions while he's speaking. So the idea, and we insist on this, is that we will bring new questions into all our attention, but in particular into Yanis' attention, to comment upon them, to reflect on these questions and their relevance for our future work. So the aim is not to answer the questions, it's not to phrase clarification questions, but actually to work together in thinking about the problems, about the issues that we need to tackle together. And to reflect on all this, we will have Yanis Varoufakis. And after his input talk, we will have some time to rework on the questions that will be suggested during his talk. Also, during the talk, you will all be able to like the questions that are being brought by the audience. The questions receiving most likes will be asked to Yanis. And as I said, after that, we will keep working on the questions by rephrasing them all together. So stay tuned after the talk. Let's work collaboratively together. And with no further ado, I will pass this now to Nicolas Aguila, who will be the session moderator of this talk.
Thank you, Ceci, and hi everyone. My name is Nicolas. I'm one of the coordinators of the States and Markets Working Group, and today I have the immense pleasure of introducing our speaker, Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis, we are very excited to have you here today, and you're a person who needs no introduction, but in case there are young people out there, let me just say that Yanis is a member of Greece's parliament and parliamentary leader of Mira 25, the Greek political party belonging to DM25, Europe's first transnational pan-European movement. Previously, he served as Greece's finance minister during the first 6 months of 2015. During his term, he experienced firsthand the authoritarian inefficiency of the European Union's institutions and had to negotiate with the Eurogroup, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. Yanis resigned the finance ministry when he refused to sign a loan agreement that perpetuated Greece's debt deflationary cycle. He is the author of a number of best-selling books, including Another Now, Dispatches from an Alternative Present, Adults in the Room, My Struggle Against Europe's Deep Establishment, Talking to My Daughter About the Economy, A Brief History of Capitalism, and The Weak Suffer What They Must, Europe, Austerity, and the Threat to Global Stability. So Yanis, thank you very much for being here with us today, and now the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. It's always very good to be back at the YSI and INET. I have lots of friends amongst people who have worked to put together this program. I shall begin with a question. Why do we need the Young Scholars Initiative, or indeed the Institute for New Economic Thinking? We don't have something similar in physics. Yes, there are conferences for young physicists. There are organizations that put together physicists, but this urgency with which you are engaged in rethinking economics is not an issue with chemistry, with physics, with mathematics, for that matter. No, the reason why it is an issue for economists, especially young economists that are moving from, let's say, a master's degree towards a PhD, the reason why this is so pertinent in your lives is a deep-seated paradox in our discipline. And the paradox is, allow me to say that, it's a controversial point I'll make, but I believe very strongly in its pertinence. The paradox is this: the more successful economics becomes as a discipline, especially within academia, within universities, within the social sciences, the more successful economics becomes, the less able the best economists are within those departments and PhD programs and schools, the less able they are to grasp capitalism, to understand capitalism, to explain capitalism, to predict capitalism. I'll repeat the paradox once more because it's mind-boggling. The more successful we are as a discipline, the less capable we are of understanding the subject matter of the discipline. Imagine if physicists had the same paradox to face. Imagine if physicists were confronted with a situation where the more successful they became within their departments of physics, the less they understood how nature works. That would have been a complete catastrophe, wouldn't it? Well, this is the catastrophe that we face as economists, but there is a reason for that. Let's, before talking about the reason for this, juxtapose Economics 101, the introductory course in economics, with Physics 101. Now, they have many things in common. Both in Economics 101 and in Physics 101, you have very basic models that are presented to students under a number of oversimplifying assumptions. The simpler models. The idea is you start with less than realistic models. Like, for instance, in physics, the simplest models need to assume that there is no friction. Sometimes there is no gravity. There is no air resistance in mechanical phenomena. Similarly, in economics, you have hugely simplifying assumptions. Assume that all other things remain equal, the ceteris paribus assumption, and so on and so forth. What is the difference between them? Both use mathematical techniques, diagrams, simplifying assumptions. They build models on the basis of axioms. The fundamental difference is that as a student of physics, as you progress, as you move from Physics 101 to Physics 204, whatever, and then to graduate study, the models that you were taught in the first year become more complicated. So you relax some of the simplifying assumptions. You introduce friction, you introduce impurities, you introduce gravity, wind, and so on. The mathematics becomes proportionately more complicated, but the essence of the model, the essence of the theorem, let's say, the laws of thermodynamics, is maintained. In economics, the moment you introduce a speck of impurity, the moment you relax, even one of those highly unrealistic assumptions. For instance, you introduce, the idea of time. The moment you introduce time into a general equilibrium model, it collapses. It simply cannot handle it. You really cannot solve a system of equations, one per market, in prices and quantities, the moment you introduce time. This is why Léon Walras, back in the 19th century, created the concept of the auctioneer. The idea is that everything stops. There are no trades, and some case the auctioneer goes from one room of a hotel to another. Each room of the hotel is a market. Adjusts prices, asks questions like, how much would you buy or how much would you sell of your stuff at this price? No buying or selling is allowed until the vector of all equilibrium prices is discovered, and then you say, okay, now trade. But the trade takes place in one instant, so time is collapsed. The time-space continuum is collapsed to one point. The moment you introduce continuous time, the whole thing collapses. So unlike in physics, where you have this proportional, the proportional relaxation of the unrealistic assumptions, leading to proportional increases in the complexity of the model, but the model remains solved, it still has a solution, which is more or less the same as the original one, only it becomes proportionately more complicated. In economics, the moment you introduce a speck of realism, like time, the whole thing collapses. Totally collapses. So you end up being, a graduate student And you have this huge conflict. Either your model is not soluble, cannot be solved, closed, or you close it, but by means of obvious as well as hidden assumptions that make it impossible to have in your model aspects of really existing economies, and in particular of really existing capitalism, to be more precise. Now, consider the tragedy of a youngster like yourselves. I know you don't need to consider it because you live it, but allow me, I'm not a youngster, allow me to discuss and comment upon your tragedy. Your academic success in academia, in economics departments, in specifically economic departments, in the best economic departments, depends on closing your models. If you don't have a model at Harvard, at Yale, in the good economics departments, good in terms of professional assessment and evaluation, you're not getting anywhere any fast, at any speed. You need to have a model that you close, you solve, and then it's even better if after you have closed it and there are some predictions that this solution, the reduced form of the model generates, then if you can show that there is a compatibility between these insights, these theoretical insights, and empirical data. And then you have effectively concluded your PhD, you get a position as an associate professor, you produce one more, 2 papers like that, you get tenure, your career is on a good track. However, you are facing a serious issue here in terms of ethics and in terms of truth. What am I referring to? To close your model, you will need to make assumptions that take you away from really existing capitalism. I already mentioned that. I don't want to tire you with this. The moment you introduce time, no solution. The moment you introduce a degree of genuine strategic uncertainty, right? Like, for instance, in a bargaining problem. Take the standard bargaining problem. 2 people are bargaining over a pie of a certain size. That is, or used to be considered by, remember John Hicks? Those of you who remember John Hicks, he used to say back in the 1930s that the bargaining problem is inherently constitutionally indeterminate. It cannot be solved analytically. And yet, with game theory, we have solved it. We have the Nash bargaining solution, we have the Rubinstein bargaining solution. But if you look at the way in which these solutions have been generated, it's through the powerful and almost violent imposition of assumptions that have no logical defense if you look at them very carefully, and which certainly cannot be taken for granted by smart people out there indulging in bargaining. In other words, if you are using a bargaining problem as a PhD student trying to write a thesis, let's say, on the negotiations in the World Trade Organization between the United States delegation and delegation from India or from the United Kingdom, whatever, you need to introduce assumptions in there that remove you from the reality of WTO organizations, or you don't close the model. And that is a horrible dilemma to put a young person in, a young scholar in. Because intellectual honesty must lead this young scholar to rejecting the closure. But rejecting the closure means you never get to finish your PhD. Or at least your PhD thesis, even if it is published, accepted by your supervisor and by your examiners, will never make it into the Journal of Political Economy. It will never be published in Econometrica, never feature in the Journal of Economic Theory, because you will not have solved it. You may have defined mathematically the problem beautifully. But if you're going to be intellectually and historically accurate and honest, there will be no determinacy, no finite solution. But if there is no solution, it doesn't get published. That is a huge paradox and a great intellectual and moral dilemma that only economists face. Physicists do not face it. Biologists do not face it. You face it. Now, I do not blame young scholars who want to get ahead and close the damn model and then do something else. Once they have imposed an equilibrium outcome of the model, which requires hidden assumptions about, common beliefs that people have no reason to have, you simply need to introduce them in a hidden and camouflaged way in order to complete the model and to solve it. You end up with certain predictions of the model. And then you can show that there is a degree of correspondence between those predictions and empirical data. But what you can't show is that you have defended empirically the closure of the model, because there is a plethora of similar models to yours, some of them making very different assumptions and axioms, which explain the data, statistically speaking, just as well as yours. So the fact that your model is not inconsistent with the data does not mean that the theory that has allowed you and the hidden assumptions to close the model have been tested in any way or form. That is the poverty of econometrics. Econometrics can show correlations that are not inconsistent with the theory, but they can never ever test the actual theory, especially a theory that has been by stealth squeezed into producing determinate outcomes. Now, the one benefit from these models is that, like chess, they sharpen your mind. The mathematics is exquisite. The analysis is very attractive. Like chess is a beautiful game. But if you try to work out from playing chess what a general should do in the battlefield, in the middle of the desert in Iraq, or wherever wars take place, unfortunately, right? Or if you try to use chess as a model from which to decide how to negotiate a deal with your neighbor, or with your supplier, or indeed within the context of the World Trade Organization, then you are a danger idiot, even if you're the best chess master on the planet. So, yes, we need models to sharpen our minds, but to think that we are going to derive the truth about capitalism, about markets, about the economy from those models is an exercise in dangerous, toxic idiocy. Now, here is where the true danger lies. This false determinism, the need that PhD students have, and young scholars, associate professors, in order to get ahead, to close their models and to create determinacy, to find the equilibrium, let's say, whether it's static or dynamic, doesn't matter, of your theory, of your model. This goes hand in hand. There is an awful synergy with financial and oligarchic power. Let me be clear on what I mean by this. Do you remember the crash of 2008? Of course, you don't remember it, you're too young to remember it, but you know about it. Let me remind you that when Lehman Brothers collapsed and the whole thing came crashing down, the whole thing being the financial markets of the West, of the United States and Europe, don't forget that, and Europe. Most financiers, most CEOs of the large banks and so on were completely caught out. There was no conspiracy. They had no idea that this crash was coming. They were dumbfounded, beleaguered, and totally distraught when they realized that, from one moment to the next, they went from immense profitability to insolvency. One of the tools that they used to have, or some of the tools that they used to have, came in the form of equations, delivering every day a number to them. Remember VAR? the value at risk number, which told them supposedly every day how much money can we lose with a probability of, let's say, 95% or 99% over the next 12 hours, overnight. And those VAR numbers made them feel really very safe in the thought that, even if we lose this, we're still solvent. And it turned out that these numbers were ridiculously off the mark. Why? Because to get to these equations, to create these models behind those numbers, financial engineers and economists had to do exactly the same thing as graduate students of economics. Close the model, find a solution, find a number, a determined number. And the only way of closing the model, finding the number, was by means of assumptions that assumed away that which needed to be explained, that assumed away, let's say, the possibility of correlated risks and correlated default probabilities. Because if they had allowed for the possibility of correlated default probabilities of bankruptcy, then they wouldn't be able to solve the model. So they did away with that. They assumed that they are not correlated to solve the model. The result was a VAR number that told the CEO of Lehman Brothers absolutely nothing. Actually did tell them things that were absolutely misleading. But for all those years until the collapse in 2008, the financial engineers and the economists that made those silly assumptions made a lot of money. So this, and the bankers, the CEOs of the Wall Street banks were effectively betting the house and the world economy on those models and making a mint year in, year out. The cacophony of money making was so enormous that if any graduate student said, hang on, folks, you're making assumptions here that are not consistent with logic, their voice would be drowned out, as it was. Many did and lost their jobs, right? So this toxic blend of academic determinism and success and financial and oligarchic power that resulted from this obscene concentration of wealth as a result of weaponizing the false models of economists does one thing. On the one hand, it creates an economics scientific profession which is successful and wrong. And on the other hand, it cements the immense power of the financiers of our society before the crash and also after the crash, because after the crash, the Fed has to step in and introduce socialism for the bankers and austerity for everybody else. So, to conclude, what should we do? What is the next step? What should young scholars aim at? Well, you've got to study all these equilibrium closed models in order to understand them so as to reject them and never to use them. But of course, that takes huge strength and courage and ethics, because it may mean that you will never get a professorship at Harvard University. And then do what? Once you have rejected those models, then you need to study power relations that determine all the important economic phenomena and which are not determinate and which cannot be reduced to the truth of a system of equations. Take debt. Debt is not a thing. It is a power relationship. Who owes what to whom has always been the essence of social, political, moral power within our societies. Capital is not a thing. Without having workers who do not own companies, being dependent on owners of companies who do not work in the companies, there is no relationship between capital and labor. There is no relationship between profits and wages. But that is a contested relationship. It is not a thing that can be included in a system of equations and solved for. The fallacy of composition, how to go from the micro from the macro, and not to assume that what applies at the micro level also assumes at the macro level, involves a capacity to transcend analytical models, and to go beyond that in the way that thinkers like Minsky and Keynes did. And finally, the only way of being a successful economist is by understanding the limits of economics and to study history, to study anthropology, to study politics and indeed literature. Because the truth about the social relations which determine interest rates, which determine the wage rate versus the profit rate, which determine the rate of interest, lies inside historical processes that are irreducible to economic models. So we need to take this paradox that I began with seriously. The paradox being that the more successful we are within the economics profession, the less we understand capitalism. Put it in our souls, grasp it, and make the huge ethical choice. Do you want a professorship at Harvard, in which case you will be poisoning the mind of young economists with untruths about capitalism? Or do you want to be a pioneer who explains capitalism to a humanity that is a victim of a capitalism gone awry? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yanis, for this inspiring talk. I felt like you described pretty accurately what is the experience of a PhD student now, so we feel contained by your words. And actually, I was also very happy that you mentioned the key role of power dynamics, because that's one of the things that our working group discusses, so that fit pretty nicely with our vision as well. So I'm getting now questions from the question constellation. Let me just remind everyone that these are not questions that Yanis will answer, but rather he will reflect on them and say whether he thinks that these are good questions or relevant questions for today. And let's see the first question. It says, how can we finance Green New Deal for Europe?
Oh, well, that is a central question, not just for Europe, but for the United States, for India, for the world. Because we are facing a species-wide challenge, an existentialist crisis. And we do know that we need something between, the minimum is 5%, and ideally something closer to 10% of GDP to go into the green transition. Good quality green jobs. So the question is, how is this going to be financed? And it is a fantastic question, because unless we can answer it, there's no point in going around canvassing for a Green New Deal. Unless we answer the question, who pays for the green transition? Where will the money come from? And I think that this question is going to bring out an essential dilemma that political parties will have, economists are going to face, governments. The dilemma being between financing it from taxation or financing it by means of public financial tools, or a combination of the two. And I think coming up with a decent answer to this question and finding the right mix between these different ways of financing the Green New Deal will make the difference between humanity's survival and extinction.
Yes, that's so very true. So then let's move to the second question. It says, what steps should the European Union take alongside President-elect Biden's US to strengthen their economic opposition against the Chinese One Belt, One Road project that is slowly spreading across the developing world?
Here I'm going to challenge the premise of the question. I don't think this is a good question. The question takes it as given that China must be challenged. There's no doubt that, I would like to challenge the Chinese Communist Party over the treatment of minorities, over the treatment of the students to whom my heart goes out at the Hong Kong Polytechnic during their demonstrations for democracy in Hong Kong. Yes, of course, we need to challenge authoritarians wherever we see it. But the axiom behind this question that China's progress and investment policies outside its borders must be challenged, that it is a threat. This is a Cold War attitude that I think needs to be questioned and very seriously criticized. The worst possible development now would be a new Cold War between the West, US and EU on the one hand, and China on the other, especially given the sorry history, track record of Western imperialism when it comes to the way we Europeans and Americans have treated the developing world. To imply that investment funding and projects coming out of China is a clear and present danger to the world. That's rich.
Yeah, thank you for that. And let's see question 3. Then, how should we most successfully combine intertwine politics with economics in both theory and practice?
Well, it is a good question. It is a good question. But again, the question presupposes a division between politics and economics. And I've always tried to tell my students when I was a professor, a full-time professor, an actual professor, not somebody who carries the title of professor and does politics these days, which is what I am guilty of at the moment. What I used to tell my students is, if you take the politics out of economics, you end up with toxic politics and awful, dangerous economics. So it's not a question of how do we combine politics and economics. It's a question of how do we economics. How do we economics in a way that the result is useful? And let me just make a controversial claim, but again, one that I strongly believe in. Going out there, walking into a shop and buying a tub of yogurt is a political action. It's a political action. You're buying a particular tub of yogurt. Firstly, you're choosing not to be vegan. That's a political choice. Okay? I'm not vegan. I'm not saying this because I'm vegan. Right? But it is a political choice. Secondly, you're voting in favor of a particular company and a particular set of producers of a particular product through purchasing it. So it is a political decision. Let me give you another example. Another example which I think is crucial in undermining the assumption behind this question, that there is a difference between politics and economics. Let's say that you have a company that goes bankrupt. The company owes money to different creditors, to the bank, to suppliers, to workers, to the government in the form of unpaid taxes, to the local authorities, unpaid rates, local rates. And let's say that the money left in the bank account or the value left, if you auction off this, all the remaining assets of the company is not enough to pay all these creditors. Who gets left out? It's like a game of musical chairs. So when the music stops, somebody will end up not sitting, not receiving any money. Who's going to be the one that gets paid first, and who is the one who gets paid last? What about workers? Do they get paid first, or is it the bankers, or is it the state, or is it creditors, or suppliers? That is a political decision, but it is also an economic decision, because it determines whether wages are going to be reduced more than the receipts of a bank. So to differentiate the political from the economic aspects of life is a basic rookie error that we must never make.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. At the risk of being repetitive, that's also another of the topics of our working group, so I'm extremely happy that you mentioned that. So then moving to the fourth question, do the assumptions of economic theory reflect reality?
Assumptions never reflect reality, hardly ever. whether we're talking about geometry, physics, or economics. So Euclid begins saying, assume that two parallel lines will never meet. Now we know, after Einstein and Riemann and others, that that's not true. But still, it's very useful to make this unrealistic assumption in order to create geometry and in order to build buildings, like the houses in which we find ourselves. So even though the assumption that two parallel lines have never meet has been disproved, and it is unrealistic, it is useful. So the question should be, are assumptions realistic? Sorry, realistic. Let me rephrase it. The correct question is, are assumptions useful? Are they helping us conquer problems that that need to be conquered through practical solutions? The problem with economics is not so much that the assumptions are unrealistic. The problem is that they're not helpful. And they're not helpful because I tried to say this in my presentation. I explained that at the beginning. Unlike in physics, where you start from very unrealistic assumptions to kickstart your theorizing, you come up with the first simplistic version of your theorem of thermodynamics, let's say, right? And then you make the assumptions more and more realistic. You reduce the unrealisticness. You make them more realistic, and you complicate the model, but the model becomes more practical and more useful. In economics, that is not the case. You make unrealistic assumptions which help you solve the model, but then the moment you introduce a tiny amount of realism in the model to make them more practically useful, then the whole thing collapses. So then you have to fall back to the unrealistic assumptions, and what happens is then you end up with lies. You end up with toxic theoretical subterfuge. So let me give you a very simple example of that, which will upset many people. Remember the demand and supply diagram, the simplest model that economic 101 students usually come out knowing. I wish they didn't, because it's sometimes knowing a small truth is far, far worse than not knowing anything. So you have the demand curve and the supply curve, right? And you try to explain to students how if demand were higher, the demand curve was not where it is, but it was higher up, then the equilibrium point would correspond to a higher price into a higher quantity, as long as the supply curve is upward sloping. Now, it is correct to say that if the demand and supply curves are where they are, the equilibrium point is at the section. And if the demand curve was higher up, then the equilibrium point would be higher up. But it is not true to say that if the demand curve goes from this position, the lower position, to the higher position, then the price will rise, because this second narrative implies time. And this is a model that cannot survive time. So because it cannot survive time, teachers, especially at high school, but also in universities, end up lying to students. Because they have this need to narrate it in time, because we are temporal beings. We're temporal beings. We live in time. We have this need to say, so when demand goes up, the demand goes, well, this is what happens to price. You can't say that. The model cannot sustain that. Because if this happens, then all sorts of other prices change. And then the demand curves and supply curves are, absolutely destabilized. And they're all over the place then. So you don't have the same demand and supply diagram. So unlike physicists who go through a process of gradual shifting from less to more realistic assumptions, we cannot do that. And we end up lying to the world and to our students.
Thank you for that. And just to conclude, I wanted to ask you whether you had some final thoughts that you want to share with us, or if you thought of new questions that we should be considering. And yeah.
Well, I've submitted my own questions to your constellation. And I'm not going to speak to them because they're there for you to check them out. But I think that the most important question that you're going to have to answer is the ethical one. What are you prepared to do to succeed as economists? And I, as an older person, I'm 60 this year, by the way. I'm saying that in order to, remind myself. I feel a huge debt to you and a great burden towards the young generation, because we have bequeathed an awful academia, an awful academic setting for you, where you have to make this ethical choice. And the choice is between being successful, but producing an economics which is not contributing anything to humanity. Indeed, it does exactly the opposite. It undermines humanity's progress. Or, becoming dissidents within your own profession in order to highlight the truth about economics. That is something that no other discipline does to young scholars.
Thank you so much, Yanis, for being here with us today. Now the first part of this session is a wrap, but stay tuned. I think we are now going back to the studio.
Okay.
Welcome back to the Lighthouse. Thank you, Nicolas, and thank you, Yanis. Yanis, I'm not sure if your questions are more of questions or provocation, but indeed, we will take this on. We are here to not only think about the world, but also to think about how to change it. That's why we are in the Economic Visions constellation. With that, let's get right back into it. I'm handing it off back to Cecilia in the question constellations, Economic Visions. See you there.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So now we will have some time to rework on the questions that we asked Yanis to comment on. And all his insights, I think, are great starting points to improve all the questions we collectively suggested. Just to make a clear point, it's not that all the other questions disappeared, but we just moved them to off topic so that we can really focus on the 4 questions that we asked Yanis to comment on. And now it's the time to work together. And to work together, in a second, I will allow you to suggest new phrasings. The idea is not to suggest a completely different question. If you have different questions, we may still consider them, but as different questions. The idea we have now is to rephrase the question to maybe broaden it a bit, starting from what Yanis suggested, rework on the phrasing, try to improve it. And then once we have new question suggestions within the same question, these new phrasings, we need to decide which of them are the best ones. So to do that, we will again ask you to use the heart option and like the phrasing that you prefer. And remember that since we started with this liking system, the question that was suggested or submitted first has all the likes. So this incumbent advantage is something that we should have in mind, and to remain here all tuned together, changing our likes if we think that a better question can be suggested or has been suggested to ask the same thing. So I will now suggest you all to start looking at the first question that we asked Yanis. And the first question that was asked to Yanis, I will read it so that you all have it in mind, and I will also highlight this question so that you can see it on your screen, is how can we finance Green New Deal for Europe? And let me just remind you on this, that Yanis, when he commented on this question, the first thing he said was that this was not only a question for Europe, but it was actually a question for the whole world, for the US, for India, and so on. So maybe an alternative phrasing could be precisely to broaden up a bit and not only focus on Europe, but the world in general. So now you can feel free to add new phrasings. If you want to comment on why you're suggesting a new phrasing, if you want to reflect on it with all of us, or maybe say some words regarding to a specific question. Now we are discussing this first one about the Green New Deal. Just raise your hand in the Zoom and we will unmute you so that you can talk with us and we can make it a more collective environment also inside the Zoom and not only inside the platform. So I will give you just some minutes. You feel free to start rephrasing. I already see another phrasing. I will change my heart particularly because I think the new one works better. Also thinking in terms of our future research projects and projects in general in YSI. We want to work on the Green New Deal and more broadly on climate challenges, but for the whole world, not only Europe. So I have already changed my heart. I invite you to also suggest alternative phrasings. Maybe there is another one that can be suggested for this question. And if there is not, remember that if you don't change your hearts, we will keep the phrasing that was originally submitted. And maybe you didn't like this question in the beginning because you preferred another question. You wanted another question to bring to all of us for the discussion. If that was the case, you can like as many questions as you want. And since this one was already suggested, feel free to just like the phrasing you prefer, regardless of the relevance you see on this question, which I'm pretty sure that we all see it as an important question. So now we have a tie. So I will give you just some more minutes and let's see what happens. And we will quickly move to the second question. So you can already start rephrasing the second question. Rephrasings are allowed for all the questions at once. So if you have a rephrasing in mind, don't wait, just start writing it, but we will collectively move one by one. Okay, so I think we can move to the next one. This question has now the new phrasing has now more and keeps receiving more and more hearts. So I think that Yanis convinced us all that we should think of a Green New Deal for the whole world and not just Europe. And the question about how we can finance it is of utmost importance. So let's now move to the next question that we asked Yanis. So I will stop highlighting this one and I will highlight the next question, which is, how should we most successfully combine intertwine, and this actually is the third question we asked Yanis, but since likes were allowed, this keeps moving, and apparently this one calls more attention than the other one, so we will move to this one now. How should we most successfully combine or intertwine politics with economics in both theory and practice? And let me just remind you here what Yanis commented upon this question. He said that there was a problem in how the question was phrased, precisely because we are kind of assuming that politics and economics are different things. And he suggested us to rephrase this question, to rework on this question, not by assuming that they are two different things when they are actually not, but actually to think of how can we rework within economics so that we do not push politics and political discussions outside of our field. So a way to rephrase this question would be to focus on how we can rebuild economics, considering that the political dimension of economics is undissociable from what used to be called just economic problems, or maybe rephrasing it saying something that there are no such thing as just merely economic problems. Every economic problem is also political, and how can we rethink of economics from that onwards? So this is challenging. The rephrasing of this question is challenging, but I suggest we move on this direction. I don't know if any of you want to suggest another alternative path to work on this rephrasing. Feel free to do it. As I said, you can raise your hands in the Zoom call and we will unmute you. And you will not be hearing my voice all the time during the rephrasing process. So we already have two alternative rephrasings. One is how to push for greater interdisciplinary research. And the other one apparently was something that the person that suggested it was not so sure about, because I don't see it there anymore. I actually think, and I of course invite you all to comment on this, that the question that was initially asked to Yanis was not so much about interdisciplinarity. It was more about what economics really is about. Of course, we need more interdisciplinary research, but the question, or the way Yanis reflected on the question, was more to just let's stay a moment thinking about economics. What's our subject matter, what we are studying, what we are doing, and we will realize that political discussions are everywhere. So it was more about rethinking economics than just saying we need to be more interdisciplinary, which is also something we need definitely in our discipline more than ever now. So I will also try suggesting a rephrasing. We have a couple already suggested. I think that all of these questions, maybe we think that this is the way to proceed, but my impression of most of the rephrasings, for instance, what is the relationship between economics and politics, or should we combine or intertwine politics with economics at all, are still in this same framework where we assume that economics is something different from politics. Maybe, as I said, you think that the best way to proceed is to thinking separately in terms of economics, politics, and how we can work on both of them together. I suggested a rephrasing also. But I still don't see it there. So far, the first phrasing is still the one that has most likes. I hope that eventually my phrasing will show up, because I don't want to refresh and lose everything that I'm seeing right now. But my question was something like, how could we rebuild economics considering politics as an internal dimension of every economic problem, or something like that? Apparently, there are some phrasings that are not there. It's not only me. So maybe we can wait a couple more minutes to let the platform refresh. I will suggest again my phrasing just in case it was lost.
Cecilia, if you're having trouble, you might want to press F5 and before you put in your phrasing again, to refresh the browser window. That usually solves the problem.
So I will refresh now. And I will let you know if your phrasings are all there or if we have new phrasings. It will take a bit, because I must say I'm in Argentina and connection here is low. So it's slow connections. And the Zoom plus the platform may take some time, which is the case. But in the meantime, you can all try to like among the phrases you have there, your favorite one. We will also have time before finishing this editing session to favorite questions. Remember that liking is different from favoriting, liking, is something we do inside the question editing sessions. And it's just a way to say, I want this question to be asked to the speaker, and then I prefer this phrasing from this other phrasing. But it's not saying this is one of the most important questions I think we have as a whole in economics, and that should be definitely part of the final 100. So before finishing this session, you will have a chance, if you do think that one of the questions that we are discussing here is part of the 100 questions that should be considered for our work in the future, then you will be able to give a star to any of these questions. And in terms of stars, we only have 10 stars each, but in terms of hearts, we have as many as we want. I think we are also running out of, no, we have some time yet. We have some, like, we don't have a lot of time, but we need to move faster. And as I said, the idea of refreshing my computer was not going to be a good one. It's only now that it's coming back. I'm sorry for this delay. But I will now say I can only, in terms of rephrasing, I still only see 4 rephrasings. I don't see mine. I don't see other people's rephrasings. So I don't know if we should try to write again the rephrasings. Just give 1-2 more minutes to this question, and then we move to the next one. I know it was not only me who suggested a phrasing that was not there. Yeah, it was not only 4 actually. I think we had like 5 different options. They're coming now. They're coming, I think. We have another one here. What does it mean for economic theory that politics and economics are always intertwined? That's interesting. And how can we ensure that the political dimensions of economics are not obscured? So these are really 2 good alternatives to move in the direction of what Yanis was suggesting us to do. So if you like any of these questions, then we can you can change your likes. And in 1-2 more minutes, we will define which phrasing we are keeping. So far, as I said, the first one has more likes, so we are keeping the first one. It's been great that you suggested a lot of alternative phrasings. This is actually part of what we were aiming to do with this part of the session, to try to improve the questions and make them collective questions. It's not the question that someone in particular suggested at some point for one session, but actually questions that we think are relevant and that we want to rework on together. And when we finish this discussion, remember that we still have 2 more questions to go. If we have the time to do them, I think we will have some time. And the next one already has an alternative phrasing. The next one is, do the assumptions of economic theory reflect reality? That one already has phrasings. Now we are in between the first one and the last phrasing. So I will give you 1 more minute for the second question, and if not, we will keep the original one, which is so far the question that has more likes. So I will just read both phrasings we are discussing now for the question on the relations between economics and politics. The original one was, how should we most successfully combine or intertwine politics with economics in both theory and practice? And after Yanis' talk, we discussed that maybe that was not the best phrasing, since it was assuming that economics and politics were different things, and the discussion was therefore how to combine them, but already assuming they were 2 different spheres. So a different or alternative phrasing that now has the same amount of likes than the first one is, how can we ensure that the political dimension of economics are not obscured? So we're now on tie, so we need someone to help us, and then we will definitely move to the next one. As I said, in the next one we already have alternative phrasing. I don't know if we have more than one now. No, just one. So we can already start working on that. Yeah, so let's just start working on the third question. The third question that I will highlight now concerns the assumptions we use in economics. And it says, do the assumptions of economic theory reflect reality? And the alternative phrasing that has the same number of votes than this first phrasing is, how can we propose economic assumptions that better reflect reality? And on this question, let me just bring to your attention what Yanis mentioned during his talk. He said that, of course, no, in every assumption, we are not directly reflecting reality. We are leaving things aside. So it's not a matter of trying to arrive at a model that has that copies entirely reality. That I would add to that that would actually be the reality itself. There is a nice story about the ideas of maps. And if you want to create the exact map that reflects everything that it's there in that piece of land, then you will basically be building a map of the exact size of the real place you're trying to map. So of course, when we map, when we build interpretations, or when we work on contemporary problems, we are leaving aside things, and that's part of the assumption process. So an alternative way to phrase it that was also suggested is, are unrealistic assumptions helpful to explain reality? So that's also a way to rework on this topic. Another rephrasing that has just came out is, can economic models and their assumptions reflect reality? So far, we have 11 likes for how can we propose economic assumptions that better reflect reality. I think that we can leave it there, but if you want to change your likes, feel free to do it, just because we need to finish in like 6 or 7 more minutes. And I will also like to give a chance to all of you to reflect a bit and suggest rephrasings for the remaining question we have, which is, what steps should the European Union take alongside President-elect Biden's USA to strengthen their economic opposition against the Chinese One Belt, One Road project that is slowly spreading across the developing world? And here, again, I will reflect on Yanis Varoufakis' comments, because I think it was very pertinent, and he was making the point of, why are we assuming that that the EU and Europe should somehow go and try to do geopolitical strategy against China, as if China had been the problem, and without reflecting about global capitalism as a whole. And he was also trying to bring to our attention the danger of a new Cold War between the West and the East. And maybe we can, since the topic is super important, but we shouldn't try to answer what to do in the question, but try to reflect a little bit more on the problem. Myself, I would suggest a rephrasing that actually aims to understand, to conceptualize the roots and also the potential dangers of a new Cold War, in this case between China and the US, eventually also the European Union. So before jumping into what should be done or where should we stand when we discuss about this problem, I would try to reflect a little bit more on, as I said, the causes and the dangers of a Cold War in the 21st century. So we already have an alternative phrasing here. How should power relations be reassessed in a post-pandemic era? Interesting. It's also broader than the question that was originally brought to Yanis Varoufakis' attention. Let's wait some more minutes to see where the other rephrasings go. Eventually, we can create a separate question with this one, but at the same time, this is a good research project, I think. Let's see what the others think. And that definitely includes the discussion about geopolitics and Cold War or trade war or tech war between the US, China, and eventually Europe in the US. That's another assumption, that the European Union will be part of the US bloc and not maybe a third contender or a country that tries to stay at bay of this conundrum. So we have maybe 2 more minutes before we move to the final step of this editing session, which is choosing our favorites. And we already have 4 alternative phrasings. Still, the first one has most of the likes. Remember this incumbent advantage. Maybe some people liked this question in the beginning, but then had to leave. But we have 2 other phrasings. One interesting one that was brought just a second ago is, how should economics address global power imbalances? And this one is more aligned to, let's say that in terms of the how general the question is, the question about reassessing power relations in a post-pandemic era is the broadest one. Then we have this one about global power imbalances, and then we have the specific one about US and China. So I think we are definitely keeping this alternative phrasing. How should economics address global power imbalances? And it's time now to allow favorites. As I said, you will have 1-2 minutes only to allow your favorites. But of course, remember that these questions that we've discussed today will all be submitted, will all be part of the constellation. And if you are not sure now, if you want to think a little bit more, you can start the question later. You only have 10 stars, and these stars can be reused during the plenary. So if you use them all today, but tomorrow you want to select another question as your favorite, remember that you just need to pick one that was already selected as a star one, unstar it, and then star the new one that you want to select within your favorites. And with this, I think we are done for today. Thank you very much. You've been great. We did a lot of rephrasings, and I now hand it to Thomas to close this session.
Thank you, Cecilia. So now we're back out in the whole graph, and we can now see all the questions that were just discussed on the session have been added to the whole graph. So all of these sessions are placed along the economic vision, but you can now see how it's included in the entire graph. And I'm actually super excited to see how great this session went. Thank you to Yanis, thank you to Nicolas, thank you to Cecilia. I thought some really great questions came out of it. Now, as Cecilia just explained, you had the chance to put favorite stars on these questions at the end of the session, but you can also do it in the constellation. So at any given time, you see over on the right that you can pick the stars. So you go in, you find the questions you like, and over the duration of the plenary, you can pick up to 10 stars. You can change them later if you change your mind, but that will help us towards the end of the plenary to get to the list of 100 questions. Thank you for joining in. And next up is Mariana Mazzucato. See you soon.